All right, guys, we are now moving into Unit 2 of the AP Psychology Notes. Unit 2 is all about the biological basis of behavior. So, this is our bio unit. So, get ready. We're going to be learning about all the parts of the brain, how the nervous system works, uh, pretty much anything related to biology and psychology. This is what we're going to be doing today. For the next few videos. So make sure you are paying attention because there's a lot of information here, guys. There's a lot of information. So we're going to break it up into two sections. The first is all just basically bio and genetics, and the second part is pretty much all just like consciousness and how that arises in our mind. So let's just kind of dive right into this first part here. Um, and some objectives as we move forward. So, first, we're going to talk about the neuron and how neurons communicate with each other. We're going to talk about neurotransmitters and the role that they play in our behavior. We're going to talk about the nervous system and how it's broken down into the major divisions. We're going to talk about reflexes and neural networks, and we're going to talk about the endocrine system, which is another system of communication in the body. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Let's start at the beginning with words that sometimes I think we use interchangeably, but mean very different things. So first up is mind versus brain. Okay, so we need to be careful with the way that we use these words. All right, so originally when we talk about the mind, and actually this is still true today, when we talk about the mind, what we're thinking about is our like consciousness. It's the thing that we're aware of. So when I'm thinking, right, that's my mind, my internal world, right, whether that's my creativity or my comprehension or other things like that, that's all the mind. So when we're talking about the mind, we're talking about like cognitive components, for lack of a better word. The brain is the organ that is in your skull, right? That is the 3.5 pounds of gray matter and features and parts of the brain and those types of things that make up the mind. Okay, so initially there was a lot of historically people didn't really know what the brain was for. As you can see, that Aristotle, one of the smartest men to ever live, thought that the brain cooled down the blood. That as the blood moved throughout the body, it would heat up. He knew about friction. So he thought that the brain must cool it down, otherwise the blood would just constantly boil. We also know that like the ancient Egyptians just thought the brain was mucus, um, which is kind of fun to think about when you think about like having a runny nose. That they thought that was like your brain leaking out. But again, if you just look at a brain, it's not really doing anything, right? At least the heart is moving, the lungs move, right? Stomach has contractions, right? Um, but the brain just kind of sits there. And especially when you're dead, which is really the only time you can look at someone's brain, it really doesn't look like it's doing all that much. It's just kind of there. So it really wasn't until recently that we got to really understand how the brain works, um, and how the different parts of the brain are related. This actually gets started in the 1800s with a guy by the name of Franz Gall, who created this who created this pseudoscience called phrenology. Phrenology was based on the idea that depending on the shape of your skull, which would therefore indicate the shape of your brain, measuring your skull could tell you things about people's personalities, whether that they were quick to anger, or they were temperate, or that they gave into their desires, or that they were adequate using languages, or they were more prone to physical labor, like all sorts of things about mental abilities was based off of the shape of your skull. Um, that's completely nonsense, right? There's no basis to that. In fact, it was used a lot for racist purposes. Um, but with everything in psych, there's always a but. Uh, it did kind of underscore the idea that there were certain parts of the brain and areas of the brain that had specific functions, that there were parts of the brain that were specialized in certain behaviors or traits or abilities, which we'll talk about in this unit. But I think it's important to understand how wrong phrenology was, but this concept that hey, if I damage this part of my brain, I'm going to lose this ability, right? Like if I damage the part of the brain that controls speaking, say through a stroke or something like that, then you're going to have trouble speaking, right? So the idea there is the same. Modern psychology, what do we say? We say the brain is the mind. Everything that happens psychologically, right, internally in your thoughts and your mind, is a result of your biology, which is a really trippy thing to think about, guys. Like, every thought that you have is the result of neurons firing at a certain rate and at a certain connection. That's it. Everything you see, and that you can understand what you're seeing, and that you can comprehend your whole entire visual world, things that you're hearing me say, are all a result of neurons firing and communicating with each other. That's it. Sharing chemical messages back and forth. That's all that is. So it's pretty amazing to think about that, everything that we experience and that we understand, every language we speak, every movie we watch, every interaction we have with our friends, all of our emotions and feelings are all based off of our brain, right? Everything that is psychological is also biological, which is, again, if you just take a few minutes and meditate on that, that's a really kind of deep notion. So, what are the functions of the nervous system? Really, there's three main functions, and I use this image. I'm not sure if it's in your book. It was in an older version of the book, but I use this image because I think it makes a lot of sense. The nervous system is responsible for really three things: input, so external stimuli, so what's going on in the world around us that we can then take into our internal world and make sense of. There's processing, which is kind of the communication within ourselves, and then there's output, which is how we then interact into the world. So in this example, the alarm goes off. We hear that through our ears. That gets translated into the brain. The brain then thinks, what is that noise? Oh, it's my alarm clock. I guess I need to get out of bed. And then the output is, I really don't like the sound of this alarm. Let me turn it off. And so your brain directs your hand to turn off the alarm. So those are the three main functions of the nervous system. And it does all of that through the connections of neurons, which are the basic cells within the nervous system. So just like how you have other cells in your body, skin cells, stomach cells, T cells, nervous system cells are specialized and they're called neurons. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to walk through the anatomy of a neuron and kind of how it works in general. We'll come back with another video about neurotransmitters and all these other things. And we'll also be talking about some of those in class as well, just to kind of have a conversation around them. Okay, so the neuron. Neuron kind of looks like this. It's kind of got like this weird body with a nucleus in the middle. It's got these like branches stemming off of it, and then it's got this like long kind of tail thing. Let's get it on here. Long time kind of tail thing that connects it to other neurons. So let's walk through each of these things in particular. So first off, there are more things in your nervous system than just neurons. There's actually things called glia or glial cells, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But neurons are really the main cells that receive, integrate, and transmit information. Okay? The vast majority of them for us are what we call interneurons. These are neurons that are connected to other neurons. They communicate to each other. There are what we'll learn are somatic neurons that kind of end in muscles or actually in skin cells or other types of senses. There's also neurons that end in muscles that allow us to move. But for the vast majority of our nervous system, we're talking about interneurons, neurons that communicate with each other. So let's go through each part and of the neurons so that we all understand everything here. So first, we have the soma. Soma is, I believe it comes from either Latin or Greek. Actually, I'm positive it comes from either Latin or Greek, and it means body. So this is the cell body. It contains the cell nucleus, and it's where a lot of the chemical kind of machinery happens. So this is where the soma is where the cells are creating the chemical messengers, known as neurotransmitters, to then relay information to the other cells. So soma means body, and therefore, right, we're talking about the cell body. It's that teardrop-looking thing on the screen. Wrong way. This way. Hello. All right. Next up, we've got dendrites. Dendrites are the branches that kind of stem off of the neuron. All right. These branches, literally, dendrite means branch. Again, I think that's Latin. Not sure. Probably Greek. Everything's probably Greek. And basically, the dendrite branches off the cell body, and they're receiving information from other neurons. Okay, so these are like like a catcher's mitt or something. It is receiving information from other neurons that it's attached to. Okay, so each branch is a dendrite, and the dendrites receive information to the cell body. The connection between neurons is called the axon. Okay, so here you can see the axon here is actually the axon for this neuron over here. Okay, so this is this neuron. You can see it's dendrites branching off, and then it has one long connection to another neuron. This is the axon. Okay, the axon is basically a long fiber, and this is where it transmits information to other cells or muscles or glands or other things that it needs to communicate to. Okay, so the axon is responsible for sending the chemical messages. That weird looking thing around the axon, it kind of looks like little sausage links. That is called the myelin sheath. Most of our neurons are what we call myelinated. Okay, it's a white fatty substance that serves as an insulator to the axon. Basically, what this does is it does two things. It protects the axon from damage, and it also increases the speed of transmission of the signals from one neuron to the other. Okay, so the myelin sheath does two things. It protects the axon so that the messages get sent, and it increases the speed of those chemical messages. Most of our neurons as humans are myelinated. Okay, not all, and not all at once. Okay, there's actually a process of maturation or myelination where the neurons over the course of our lives become myelinated. Maybe you've heard that the human brain doesn't stop developing until age 25, right? It's not like the brain is growing, right? It's not like it's really small and it grows. It's always the size of your skull. But what we're talking about there is we're actually talking about the myelination process, right? So the myelin sheath protects the axon, speeds transmissions of neural signals so that they can get to the other cells quicker and safer. Okay, some diseases actually attack the myelin sheath. If you know multiple sclerosis, right, MS, that causes damage to myelin sheath, which slows down nerve communication, which is why people with MS sometimes have trouble walking or speaking or fine muscle movements or other things related to the nervous system because their myelin sheaths are being damaged and it's taking longer for the messages to be sent and to connect. Okay. Just a quick thing here. Each kind of little sausage link on the myelin sheath has a name. They're called a node of Ranvier, Ranvier, Ranvier. I hope my French pronunciation is good enough. That's just kind of like a little added bonus here. I'm not sure that that'll show up on any tests, but those little kind of sausage links that's what they're called. Okay, now to the main part here. So at the end of the axon, there's another branch that occurs. And those branches form what we'll call terminal buttons or terminal ends or axon terminals or something like that. But it always almost has the word terminal, which means end. And this is where the neurotransmitters are secreted. The chemical messages that the neuron is sending to the other neuron are sent through the terminal buttons and to the synapse. These messages could tell another neuron to, hey, activate, let's go, send this message along. Or it could say, hey, stop, slow down. We'll talk more about those two things later, but those are the type of messages really that are sent, which is also trippy to think about, that basically all the messages are yes, send this along, or stop doing what you're doing. And that relates to our entire mental world. But I digress. What you can't really see in this image is that the terminal buttons and the don't actually touch the dendrite. There's actually not a physical connection there. There's a little gap, and that gap is called a synapse. Okay, we'll talk more about the synapse later, but the synapse is the junction where the terminal buttons and the dendrites of the receiving neuron are closest. Okay, this is where the information is actually transferred. And we'll talk about what happens at the synaptic cleft in a little bit, probably in another video. All right, I also told you that there are other cells here called glial cells. Okay, this is basically the support staff of the brain. And if you've ever heard of the blood-brain barrier, that is essentially the glial cells. So our body's pretty amazing. So we know that viruses and bacteria and other types of bad things can travel in our bloodstream. So in order to protect the brain, neurons aren't connected to the bloodstream. There's an intermediary, and those are the glial cells. So they are attached to the bloodstream, which then filter out any bad things that could harm neurons, and then share the nutrients from the blood to the neurons to keep things moving along. They're essentially like the support structure of the nervous system. I think that's pretty amazing, right? That we have this kind of system that protects our neurons from danger and disease. Any sort of drug that has any sort of psychoactive effects is able to bypass the blood-brain barrier and affect our, perception or cognition or whatever's going on. Glial cells also remove toxins from the nervous system and from the neurons themselves and put them back in the blood to be filtered out by, our liver or kidneys or whatever is the appropriate filtration system that we have. So that's the anatomy of a neuron. I think it makes sense to stop here, and we will talk more about what actually we're talking about when I say that the neurons are communicating with each other, and what we're talking about when I say chemical messages and how all this stuff works. Okay, so we'll come back with another video about the functions of neurons, and yeah, so I'll see you then.